Hello, I'm Keith Stone, and welcome to the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series. Our guest today is Maša Ćulumović. She is a fellow in Pindaric Studies at the Center for Hellenic Studies, where she is working on a Pindar commentary in progress, which is a digital publication, which she is co-editing with Greg Nash. You, Maša, have held positions at Furman University, University of Puget Sound, Miami University, and Brandeis University. You have been a postdoctoral researcher, directing an EU-funded project called Poetics of Space in Ancient Greek Victory Odes. You've published on Pindar and are an editor of the CHS Classics At volume on ancient lyric poetry, as well as co-editor and a contributor to the Proceedings of the Logic of Lists workshop, to be published in the next Classics At issue. And in general, your ongoing project is the study of poetics of space, geography, and landscape in ancient Phoenicians. So welcome. Thanks for joining us again. This isn't your first.
Thank you for having me.
So today you're going to talk about, and I forgot to actually write the title down, Pindar's Poetics of Homecoming. Excuse me. So looking forward to it. Take it away.
Okay, so maybe I can just start, I think, with your introduction in mind by saying how I got interested in the topic I will talk about today, which has to do with homecoming, which by definition is associated with two places, right? With the home and the destination from which the victor, in this case, a hero, in other cases, returns. I came to it, to this sort of particular detail, from, as you said, the study of, in more general, poetics of space and geography, space in the broadest sense of the word, to include local landscapes, small sort of miniature scale spaces, as well as larger spaces. And the extant corpus of Pindar's Victory Odes traverses vast expanses of space, from the Pillars of Heracles and Gibraltar in the west to the Black Sea in the east, from the mythical northern land of the Hyperboreans to the southernmost sources of the Nile. So basically, all of the known world at the time, not in the single ode, obviously, but in the corpus as we have it, there all of the space is covered. And along a different vector, we get references from the heavenly Mount Olympus all the way to the farthermost reaches of the underworld. So I was, from my first sort of instance of reading Pindar, I was really struck by these vast expanses of space, but also by very elusive and consequently very elusive shifts between those geographical references and locations. It seemed, at first sight, it seemed like jumps for no particular reason, or the reason that I couldn't see. So I started mapping out all the odes to see sort of what triggers these spatial shifts and expansions. But from the beginning, I knew that I would have to deal, and I thought at the beginning, as almost by way of introduction, with the two most important geographical locations in every victory ode, in every Pindaric Epinician, which are, as I mentioned, the site of the victory, which is athletic version of a heroic destination, and the athlete's hometown. Well, that introduction turned out to be, which I thought I could deal with, even as a matter of prologue, in my book, turned out to be much more complex and had more interesting things than I anticipated. So that's what I'm sort of going to deal with today. So I won't go into all the places that myth covers, which are clearly much more diverse. I will focus on the site of victory and the athlete's hometown, and that's what I call the poetics of homecoming in the odes. So the two most important, as I mentioned, geographical locations were also integral elements in the proclamation of an actual victory at the site of competition, and also, perhaps even more importantly, in the process at large that bestowed glory upon an athlete and his community. So along with these two, the place of the site of victory, victor's hometown, also obviously the athlete's name and his father's name, his surname, would have been mentioned, as well as the competition in which he won. So the inclusion of these references, and in particular the two locations in the victory odes, is not surprising. The more I looked into this, though, what became surprising to me is that they have been traditionally, and still to this day, I think for the most part, viewed primarily as one of the required elements in the poet's encomiastic program. So sort of as a checklist of items to be mentioned. So who, what, where, when, and then potentially a list of other things that a patron may have asked Pindar specifically to mention in his odes. And sometimes these are more, sometimes less obvious, which would have been sort of commissioned by the patron. But so what I found out when I looked more closely at this supposedly checklist items of the site of victory and the site of the hometown was two things. Well, first of all, I don't want to debate that there is the conventional nature of the whole genre of victory odes as a whole. But what I want to stress is that the convention alone does not fully account for a couple of things. First, the references to these two locales in Pindaric odes are repeated. So they're not just as in a checklist mentioned once and then we're done with it. So they are repeated, usually at the beginning and the end of the composition, which is why for some of the focus passages today, I chose the short whole ode, Olympian 5, and then the openings of three other odes, one of which significantly doesn't follow the usual pattern, which is that there are repeated references to the site of victory and the site of the athlete's hometown at the beginning, and then at least once at the end of the ode. One of the odes, Pythian 11, doesn't actually. It closes straight with the myth, which is very unusual for Pindar, so that's an exception. But most other odes have the mentions of these two locations at the beginning and at the end, and especially at the beginning, constantly shifting between the two locations. So I would argue, and so this is my bigger argument, and I will try to show it on specific examples, that victory odes employ numerous references to geographical sites of athletic victories and athletes' hometowns, as well as shorthand descriptions of their respective local landscapes and topography. So it's not always obviously the same reference. It's not always Olympia mentioned as Olympia. Sometimes we get local landmarkers, rivers, hills that are there. So Pindar displays a great mastery in varying references to these sites, which is why they flow so easily. But he is actually constantly shifting back and forth between the two. And what I'm arguing is that these references and shifts between them are there not merely to satisfy the established programmatic requirement of praise poetry, but more importantly, to visualize, recreate, and locate the space of the victory within the athlete's hometown and vice versa. And here I would just like to, before we turn to the actual examples, to make two observations. First, that those two locations form a sort of a spatial axis around which all the other places, and there are many, especially once you get into the myth, but all of them are organized around these two and they're constantly drawn to them. For example, mythical section with all of their spatial expansions almost exclusively start with and return to one of these two focal locations. So that's first. And secondly, there is the constant, as I mentioned, shifting along this, what I call the victory hometown axis, because it's so important. And that shifting itself creates an ambiguity that I think is an intentional strategy on the part of Pindar, designed precisely to blur the lines between the site of the victory and the site of the song's performance, which these days most scholars agree would have been in the hometown. And this strategy opens up the athlete's single individual victory for cooptation by wider public spheres in space as well as in time. So for reperformances and such. So that's my bigger argument, and I hope to show it in discussing specific passages. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the announcement, the actual herald's announcement of the victory at the competitions, and Pindar's inclusion of that announcement in some of the odes. So, as I said, the exceptional emphasis on the two locales reflects in part the traditional announcement by the herald at the games, which included the names of the winning athletes, their families and cities, as well as the events in which they competed. Now, while Pindar occasionally mentions the original announcement that was made at the site of the games, more frequently he takes that task directly upon himself. So, for example, he often refers to himself as a messenger, angelos, or as a kerix, in his dialect karux, herald, which is a title that's even more evocative of athletic contests, since it was officially bestowed upon men who actually, after winning their own contests in heraldry, would go on to serve as public announcers during the rest of the competitions. So that's sort of, it's important to have that in mind, I think, when reading, especially these references to Pindar as announcing or proclaiming or heralding. And so that's why I have a slide show with mostly maps, but on the first image, I have two short passages, which I think are very striking in incorporating an announcement or herald's message in the odes, and with very interesting twists. So if we can just show the first slide. Perfect, thank you. So the first example is from Pythian 9, and I'll just read out the English. You will see, if you look at English and Greek, it was really hard for me, and I tried to follow the Greek word order, but it really, which is important for my point. So I will try to point it out in both English and Greek. I wish, Pindar says, in announcing with the help of deeply girdled graces, Telesicrates, a blissful man, as a bronze-shielded Pythian victor. So, and we continue, I wish, in doing this, to proclaim a crowning glory for horse driving, Cyrene. So we see immediately the importance and the interconnection between the location of the victor and the victor's hometown on both the structural and the functional level. You notice the two nouns naming the places. So victor at Pytho, Pythionikan in line 1, which I couldn't squeeze in until I got to line 3, but at least I tried to place it at the line end as it is, as metrically as it is in Greek. So those two nouns, Pytho in victor at Pytho, and Cyrene at the very end, reflecting Greek Kyranas in line 4, they occupy final emphatic positions in their respective metric constructions. So they're really noticeable. They're sort of punctuate the sentence, and they enclose the two verbs of proclamation between them, right? Angelon in line 2 in Greek and gegonein in line 3. And each of these verbs is loosely associated with the place name closest to it, right? So angelon, going the way I translated it, going more closely with Pytho, and gegonein with Cyrene, although they're close enough that really hearing this performed, hearing the poetry of it, makes it feel as if they're thoroughly interwoven, that both verbs go really with both places. But really the strict direct object of the two verbs is the athlete himself, right? Telesicrates, who is named in the center of the section and in the emphatic line initial position. So I think that's not coincidental, and on paper it's very striking, but as I tried to point out, hearing it metrically, what's at the beginning and at the end also resonates with the listener. So it is he, Telesicrates, who is announced as the Pythian victor, he who is proclaimed as the crowning glory, the Stephanoma of Cyrene. So he is the link between the two locations, and as such, he provides opportunity for Pindar to masterfully blend the original announcement at Pytho with the present one in Cyrene. as he is the one who joins the two in the here and now of the Epinician celebration. So that's Pythian 9. In Isthmian 3, there's a rare image of the victor himself. It's in this case Melissus of Thebes, who is envisioned as making the official announcement. So right before this excerpt, we are told that 2 victories fell to Melissus' lot. And now I'm reading. One, when in the glens of Isthmus, he received garlands. And then when he proclaimed Thebe, again, both Isthmus at the end of the line and Thebe, eponymous nymph of Thebes, at the end in the hollow valley of the deep-chested lion by winning in the chariot race, right? So the second victory being at Nemea. As I mentioned, again, the 2 place names are in an emphatic metrical position, and the athlete here is implied in the dative dexameno, right? He is the one receiving the garlands, because in the section that I skipped, it is the 2 victories fell to him receiving, and so forth. That's the syntax of the passage. So the announcement is clearly metaphorical. The act of Melissus' victory is a metaphorical announcement of that act, but that is the device that allows Pindar to effectively recreate in his own song the proclamation by putting it in the athlete's mouth that associates the location of the victory with the athlete's hometown. Now, the transference between the agents of the announcement from herald to Melissus and its subjects from Melissus to Thebes is telling, because it effectively equates the athlete with his hometown. So in different ways, both passages emulate and reenact the original victory proclamations. And I see here the effects of that strategy on 2 levels. First, by evoking and imitating the immediate post-competition moments, the songs recreate the atmosphere of victory for the athlete and his family members. It's as if they're hearing it in the moment. But more importantly, also for his townsmen and fellow citizens who may not have followed the athlete on his voyage to and from the competition, but are now gathered ready to celebrate his accomplishment. So that's number 1, sort of expanding the audience of this announcement further from the initial one at the site of the victory. And secondly, by embedding the victory announcement within the odes with their more expansive and elaborate means of praise, Pindar's poetry imbues those originally fleeting moments with more weight and permanence. And we will see in one of the examples, he actually contrasts the short, brief refrain of Archilochus, which sufficed at that moment of the actual victory, with his own ode, which is a much more permanent memorial to the athlete's victory. Now, not all the Epinicians make explicit references to literal or metaphorical heralds and announcements, but in every Pindaric ode, one can find an unmistakable moment which, with the voice of authority, clearly evokes that official proclamation. Now, his artistry, of course, comes to light in the very unique variations of individual expressions in each ode, so it never seems repetitive or overdone. He varies the number of the 2 locations that he mentions, the way in which he refers to them. I already mentioned briefly, by either proper names or paraphrased in terms of certain landscape markers, and also the kinds of transitions he makes between the 2. And when we look closely at all of these elements in a second, I think we see a little bit more complex picture of the function and the importance of these 2 places than has generally been noticed. So I think a good starting point, and that has sort of been my go-to ode for pointing these interesting connections, is Olympian 5, which is one of the shortest in Pindaric corpus, and conveniently enough for my purposes, now it doesn't have the big mythical section. It just deals in terms of geography. It is just between Olympia and the victor's hometown, which in this case is a Sicilian city of Camarina. So the ode, in many ways, encapsulates and exemplifies what I was just talking about. So I will just quickly read a sort of paraphrase the ode, focusing on the references to the two places. And just as a background, it was composed, as I mentioned, for the Olympic victory. It was in the mule cart race for Psalmis, is the name of the athlete of Kamarina, who is an interesting character, possibly ethnically a mix of a Sikh and a Greek, but in any case, a wealthy, obviously wealthy and prominent citizen of Kamarina, on which the ode actually focuses quite a bit. So the ode has 3 triads, and each of them is addressed to a different deity. Oh, sorry, I should actually say, if we can show the next slide, where just a map of Sicily. So Kamarina is on the south shore. You can see it is between Akragas, sort of halfway between, yes, thank you, between Akragas and Syracuse. So in the first triad, the city's eponymous nymph, Kamarina, the daughter of Ocean, is asked to receive Psalmis, who exalted her people-nourishing city. We have Tan San Polin Lautrophon in line 4. He exalted it at the Olympic Games in Olympia, which is also then further paraphrased as the greatest festival of the gods. He did this by providing feasts of oxen sacrificed on the 6 double altars in Olympia, and by furnishing entries in the races with chariots, mules, and single horses during the 5 days of athletic contests. And in fact, we have another ode, Olympian 4, for the same athlete, but a different victory in chariot racing. This one is for mule races, and this reference to the races with chariots, mules, and single horses probably also includes the victory that's celebrated in Olympian 4. The ode continues saying that in doing so, Psalmis has brought fame to his father and his glory to his father Akron. So we have the name of the father mentioned, check. And the newly built city, Tan Neoikon Hedran. The epithet newly built, I won't get too much into it, refers to a sort of turbulent history of Kamarina, which was settled and destroyed and resettled several times. The final settlement in 460 BC is probably the one referred to here. The important thing is that Psalmis took part in this rebuilding process. And another allusion to this event and Psalmis's potential involvement is in the second triad as well. So this triad is addressed to city protecting Athena, of whose sanctuary, Alsos Hagnon, that's how it's referred to, Psalmis is imagined as singing upon his return from Olympia. So if we had Melissos of Thebes announcing his hometown to the world, here Psalmis is imagined as singing, presumably similar celebratory song on his way back from the lovely abodes of Oinomos and Pelops, again a reference to Olympia, this time through its mythical characters associated with the founding of the Olympic Games, the chariot race in particular. So here the mule cart race, but still pretty appropriate. Now, the reference to Athena's precinct starts off a series of local landmarks. And if we can show the next slide, I just want to mention that a 5th century, fortunately for us, for me studying space and landmarks in this ode, a 5th century temple of Athena in Kamarina is well known and has been excavated. This is the simple floor plan. The temple was situated at the summit of the hill, if we can show the next slide, where it is in the city, near the center of the city. So you can see Agora and then Tempio, it's an Italian map, to the east of it. Thank you, yes. So that's where it was. Today, unfortunately, only a handful of stones from its walls survive in situ. But interestingly enough, most of the structure was used for the masonry of the 19th century building, which now houses the Museo Archeologico Regionale di Camarina. So in an ironic twist of fate, the museum quite literally incorporates the temple remains. So we have a reference to the Temple of Athena, and I think if you go to the next slide, there it zooms out so that we can thank you. So we can see the other landscape markers that follow, and those are the river Oanus, Potamon Oanon, and that's in the south, yes, and then the nearby lake in the north, which is the Lake Kamarina, which was invoked in the opening triad in the form of the city's eponymous nymph. And finally, the sacred canals of the river Hyparis, which is in the north edge of the city, which provide water for the community and serve as a means of transporting building materials necessary for Kamarina's frequent rebuilding efforts. Now, I should mention that this is an exceptional example of such detailed reference to not just local landscape, but even a bit of a sociopolitical history, or at least an allusion to it, if not explicit reference, in terms of how building materials would have been transported. But Pindar manages to work it in so effortlessly to sort of form, even if I'm now showing you the maps, but just by reading the ode, you can kind of imagine these local landscapes and landmarks. So at this point in the ode, I don't know if you have noticed, but I will sort of point it out now. The composition has moved between references to Kamarina and Olympia no less than 5 times. So from Olympia to Kamarina, if people are looking at their Greek text in lines from Olympia to Kamarina in lines 1, 8, and 10, and from Kamarina to Olympia in lines 4 to 5 and 8 to 9. So I should know that these are, so to speak, absolute spatial shifts in terms of the order of their mention. That's something that first struck me in reading a lot of Pindar's opening, that there are multiple mentions of the site of victory and the hometown, and that they're not all lumped together. There are constant shifts between the two. So from, as I say, sort of in absolute terms, it seems like we're moving back and forth. But the whole time, the origo, or the deictic center in the act of song's utterance, has remained fixed in Kamarina, actually. And that's indicated by the verbs of motion: to receive, the city is asked to receive. So that's where we are, that's the point of view. And then to come, the verb to come, both of which are anchored in the hometown, to which Psalmis is envisaged as returning, and whose community is encouraged by the poet to welcome him with due celebration. Now here, I will just do it briefly, and I will read it out, because usually I don't know how to condense it. But in studying space in Pindar, I think one cannot but look at deictic field of language. So I will just briefly explain what that is. And the deictic, the word coming from the Greek word deiknomi, to show or to point, the deictic field of any language is characterized by tripartite space-time person orientation, where the here, now, I, the time, place, and the speaker, those 3 references form the point of origin. That's what I mean when I say origo, or when I say deictic center. And from that 0 point of the subjective orientation, all other coordinates are determined with respect to the speech act. So second person, or addressee, is the addressee. The third person, non-participant in the speech act, who may or may not be present or absent. And also each of the person that we have, the person, is associated with a corresponding spatial coordinate. First person deictics, words which point or show location, are proximal in that they refer to objects in the neighborhood of the speaker. This thing by me, so demonstratives are also deictic, while second person deictics designate an addressee, right? That by you. And they're less clearly localized, and in terms of terminology, so they're either proximal, felt quite closely, or at some remove, distal. And third persons are not identified by position, as I mentioned, but by non-participation in a speech act. So they can be proximal or distal. And finally, there is a temporal deictic simultaneity, in that the interlocutors share a time frame now, right? And verb tenses are defined relative to that temporal deictic So that's sort of important to keep in mind for the deictic analysis of any text. Here now I, origo, and then everything else, how is it arranged around it? So in this case, we are aware that from the point of view of the poem, we are in Kamarina. So all the shifts are just mental shifts that are taking place. Now, as I mentioned, the direction of the spatial movement in both instances of these verbs, which are also have deictic quality to them, to receive, to come, right? They indicate direction, is unambiguously homewards and away from the site of the victory. Those two enunciative speaking moments are each followed by complementary sections in their respective triads. In the first, the exhortation to Kamarina to receive psalmis is followed by a description of his past activities in Olympia. And here we have a really typical way in which Pindar makes these location switches through the relative pronoun hos. So receive psalmis in Kamarina, who did all of these things in Olympia. And that's the method by which Pindar then switches from one place to another. And in the second triad, Psalmis' act of returning from Olympia is presented through a song about his hometown environs in the present, right? So everything that we hear about Kamarina, about the rivers, the lake, is envisaged as Psalmis singing about this. Now, although the song is metaphorically transferred to Psalmis' voice and persona, we are, of course, dealing with the present performance of the Pindaric composition, which is why it's so beautiful, because the poem is taking shape in the very act of being described. I just find it thrilling. Now, the last triad invokes the third theory of the ode, Zeus Soter, and he is envisaged as localized primarily in Olympia, although this is also a convenient device in a polytheistic culture that you can even when you locate a specific god very, very precisely in a certain landscape, you can be anywhere and still invoke him or her. So Zeus is envisaged here as in Olympia. He's inhabiting the hill of Kronos in Olympia and honoring the wide flowing Alpheus and the holy cave of Ida. And for these, we can maybe just go to the next couple of slides. The first one, I just love these old maps of Olympia, not terrible. You can see in the north, the hill of Kronos, Alpheus, all the way to the south. The river and the cave of Ida is a bit of a mystery, to which I'll get into in a second. If we can go to the next slide, it's a bit more precise map of the same location. You can see Alpheus and the hill of Kronos in the north. And in the next slide, there is an attempt to locate the cave of Ida by in a German edition. I don't know if you can see, it's sort of northeast. It's Idaische Grotte, right? But with a big question mark. No, I climbed the hill of Kronos, and there was no trace whatsoever of any cave or cave-like structure. So most commentators these days are very skeptical about that reference. Okay, and so I'll just finish the reading of the ode. In the last triad, also other than this reference to Zeus, where we get the local landscape in Olympia, what is also interesting from the deictic point of view is that the first person Epinician speaker now interjects with a self-reference for the first and only time in the song, and he announces his arrival. He says, "I come as your suppliant," right? And here, the enunciative speaking ego entreats Zeus to honor Kamarina, Polintande, this city. So that's another argument, evidence that we are in Kamarina, this city, right? It's the place where the speaker is. And so he entreats Zeus, and in a parallel construction, he addresses Psalmis, the Olympic victor himself, in a apostrophe. He says Olympionike. And this double apostrophe between Zeus and Olympic victor combines distal and proximal deixis, right? Distal to Zeus in Olympia and proximal to Psalmis in Kamarina, pointing or deixis, which is also a wonderful way to bring the god and the man closer together, especially in the light of the ode's request to adorn this city with famous deeds of manliness, of which both Zeus and Psalmis can be seen as agents on divine and human level, respectively. But this is a dangerous path, and Pindar is quick to clear any potential confusion. The final words of the ode resound powerfully. He says, if someone is prosperous, literally, if he nourishes, if he waters prosperity, let him not seek to become a god. So just as we brought them close together, we are warned in a very Epinician manner that that humans can only just so approach gods, but never quite match them. So I'm looking at the time now, and I am open for questions. I wanted to give you, because I talked just about one ode, but this is really an example of a widespread phenomenon, and so I have an example of opening of Olympian 1, Olympian 9, Pythian 11, which are from different for athletes from different regions. So it's not region specific, this phenomenon at all. So I don't. Maybe Keith, you should guide me. Should I go through these examples quickly?
I'm thinking, well, maybe if we have a couple of questions now.
Yeah, maybe
we can hear those, and then you can pick a good example that might relate to those questions. Or
sure. That sounds great.
So, Maria, I see you.
Yes.
A question. Okay, you're muted, Maria. And I'm trying to unmute you. There you go. Oh.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Maša, for this excellent presentation. I really like the way you presented to us what we may call the vicissitudes of space, or the poetics of space in the Pindaric Epinician ode. This is my question is, I would say, more of a supplementary nature. Could you tell us more, or could you provide us some insight how this could have worked, the poetics of space, in what other scholars call the reperformances of Epinician odes? I mean, this, what you call the poetics of deixis, of hic, nunc, et ego. How this would have worked if the Epinician ode is reperformed in a totally different space other than the original place or space of performance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, because this is wonderful, because the first example that I was going to follow with is the opening of Olympian 1, which I think is a great example of how it could have worked in a completely different setting when reperformed. But before getting into that specific example, maybe I should step back and say where I stand in this, because it is an old and vexed question about where, even forget about reperformance, where Pindar's odes would have been performed, where in the past the scholars tended to be divided between the place of victory and the victor's hometown, especially for some shorter ones, which seemed impromptu, which I strongly disagree with, because I think there's nothing impromptu about Pindar ever, even in the short odes. So I actually think, and I think the scholarly consensus these days is that as a matter of rule, they would have been the first performance, the premiere would have been in the athlete's hometown, and that it would have been most likely a really big public event. So either associate, very often, so it's clear from the poem's language, song's language, that they were often associated and performed within a context of some local festival, religious festival. And here it's Olympian 9, which is quite clear. It closes by saying, and place this wreath on the altar of Iacos. It's for a winner from Egina. Oh no, sorry, it's from Opus. Sorry, it's the different Ajax, not the Aeginetan Ajax, Ajax Ilos. So it closes with a ritual gesture. So it sort of strongly suggests a wider festival and religious context within which the ode would have been performed. But whatever the case, I am convinced that most of them, if not all of them, as a premiere, would have been performed in a public event. So to draw not just Victor's family, close and extended, but also the whole city, which is what also all of these city references and local landscape references are then working with. Now, these days, as you mentioned, people are focusing more on the question of re-performance, and it is clear to me, at least, again, from the Pindar's references, but also from ambiguities in references, that I really am strongly convinced that he composed his odes with an eye to re-performances in different settings. So even when we have deixes, it can always be distal or in the imagination. You don't have to, you can be inside the house, for example, and not in a public square to see the Temple of Athena. But I do think that he had in mind these smaller settings, possibly sympodic settings. And I think Olympian 1 is a really good example. So I won't go through everything I wanted to say about this ode, but in the opening lines, it's the setting are not big city festivities, therefore Hieron of Syracuse, so not, even though we have a lot of mentions of Syracuse and Sicily, broader Sicily, but the most immediate setting is around Hieron's hearth. People have gathered, and so not just any people, sophoi, so an obvious reference to poetry, people who understand the poetry being performed, Hieron's close companions and family. And again, there is a very strong sympodic setting, which couldn't be more different. I think this is sort of what you were alluding to, Maria, than how I described and how I think the premiere performance of even this ode would have been. I don't for a second believe that would have been the first, the premiere of this poem. But I do think that it sort of creates this, when performed in a larger public setting, it creates this illusion of an intimate, private setting where it's the people in the know who are listening and understanding Pindar's references. He has a wonderful metaphorical use of the verb amphiballo. Here, he is, which literally means to put around, throw around his song, but it's also a very technical term for putting a victory wreath, a Stephanos, on a victor's head. So in that way, he's combining his song with the athlete's victory. But I think that's a very good example where it is tempting to see it as Pindar's language setting up performance in a very small private setting, but that the actual performance would have been in public, and it would have worked just as well. More of people would have felt included as being on the poem, in the know, it's sophoi, but they could also then be just as easily re-performed in different settings. So Olympian 1 is like that, but I think a lot of the other odes have that sort of elusive sense of how wide is the public for the composition, which I think is intentional, so that it could be re-performed in different ways. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay.
One if I just Keith, may I just ask one more question, which is also relevant?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Maša. I think this is a wonderful overview about the vexed issue of reperformance that you mentioned, and you really gave us a very succinct view of what's been going on around, the performances of Pindar's odes. I don't know whether you would be kind enough to tell us if the template that you mentioned about Pindaric Epinician odes, the Dixis, the Hic Nunc Ego, and also there are certain patterns that the poet follows, Pindar. These are also met in his rival, Bacchylides, due of course to genre, but whether there are significant differences that which make the Bacchylides different than Pindar.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you for that question. And in fact, when I started this project, I wanted to look at space in the definition genre. So, okay, Pindar is the most prominent representative, but Bacchylides is close second. Unfortunately, we don't have many other examples of victory odes. So in fact, at the beginning, I wanted to look at these spatial relationships, poetics of space within the genre. I sort of got stuck on Pindar, and Bacchylides is on the back burner. But from what I found, that's partly why I left him on the back burner. Not because I don't at all subscribe to the school of thought that considers him inferior to Pindar in any way. I find, in fact, some of my favorite lines are actually from Bacchylides. But in terms of he does shift the same kind of shifts between the hometown and the site of victory, but not as intensely as Pindar. And especially in these opening lines where Pindar will do it, as I try to point in Olympian 5, but many other odes. If you don't read it continuously, where it flows smoothly, if you try to chart it out and map it out, as I did, it becomes constantly this shift between, in this example, Olympia Camarina. It's not, Pindar is amazing, so you never feel it as so boring, but it's a lot more intense, I would say, than Bacchylides. In Bacchylides, I have a bit more of a sense of a checklist. They do both use it as a hinge or a jumping off board. As I mentioned, it's always wherever else we move in the ode spatially, it starts and returns back to one of these two places. So that's the same. That's a very convenient hinge for mythical expansions. Bacchylides does the same thing. But in these constant movements between the two locations, it's not as frequent as Pindar. So that's at least what I found.
Maybe now would be a good time to return to one of the odes.
So sorry, Keith, I didn't hear.
Oh, maybe now would be a good time to return to one of the other odes.
Okay, so we looked at Olympian 1, where I sort of paraphrase it. Let me find it. The second example is interesting that I wanted to look at is Olympian 9. Okay, because I wanted to look, as I mentioned, I wanted to make a point that this is regardless of where the athlete is from. So Sicilian, because the Sicilian nodes, which form about 1/3 of Pindar's corpus, so they're quite significant. They're somewhat distinctive in their reflections of the historical connections between the ruling elites of the island, and in particular the influence that Hieron and Syracuse wielded over Sicily in the 5th century BC. So that we get this expansion of space. Even in Olympian 1, we go from Hieron's hearth to Syracuse, the city, to Sicily as an island, so these sort of expandable limits of what the individual polis associations are. But I just to sort of make a point that that's not exception in terms of Pindar's treatment of space. Olympian 9 is for a victor from Opus in central Greece. It's Epharmostus of it's a Locrian city. And I mentioned the opening here, which opens with a mention of a brief triple refrain attributed to Archilochus that would have been chanted in honor of the victor in the immediate aftermath of the Olympic victory. But this impromptu refrain is set up only as a foil for the present occasion, which promises a celebration on a much grander scale. And Pindar, this is one of my favorite examples, Pindar defines that scale in terms of the distance between the site of the celebration, and he actually talks about 2 sites of Epharmostus' victories. It's for an Olympian victory, but somehow in the references, Olympia and previous victory in Pytho in Delphi are treated almost on the same footing. So he says, in effect, fine, this short chant sufficed for there and then, but just as we have now traveled and we're at home, my poem will be more permanent and more of a memorial. So he says his song will echo from Opus and reach, like arrows shot from a bow, Olympia and Pytho. So they have happened there, and the news of their celebration will go back to these 2 locations. So once again, we're involving these 2 locations in the present celebration and transporting, in effect, the audience to their splendor. And again, just like in the examples discussed above, the movement between the 2 sites is repeated within just 10 lines. So first, Opus is named. It's briefly characterized by its orderly life. Later, it's paraphrased as the Locrian's famous mother of splendid trees. But between those 2 references to Opus, we have references to Olympia and Pytho. And just maybe briefly to say, just as in Olympian 1, this paraphrase, the Locrian's famous mother of splendid trees, is not just another way of saying the same thing. It also expands the realm of geographic references, right? Just like we had Hieron's hearth and Syracuse and Sicily, here we move to not just the city, but the whole region, the Locrian's mother. And my argument is that with this expansion of geographical references, also the praise brings into its fold a wider spectrum of potential laudandi, the praised, community praised, while at the same time, by somewhat conversely, granting the victor a larger space in which his victory matters. So it's, as everything in Pindar, it goes both ways and it's reciprocal. Should I go on? And are there any questions? Yes, please.
Georgia.
Thank you very much. May I ask, just adding to your comment on the geographic expansion of the praise, the geographic expansion of the praise could then be taken a step further and get to the Panhellenic dimension, and then we have a kind of a greater resonance. And in this framework, we even have a kind of a, let's say, a homecoming of a different magnitude. If we place it historically after the Persian invasion, whether we really can, let's say, understand the odes in this framework of just giving the message about being one of many, and spreading the word of this kind of praise, of belonging to a larger community. because actually it comes to mind that Olympian 1 actually is not Olympian 1 because Pindar put it as the first of his odes. So Aristophanes of Pisidium thought of something. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of work in the first place, but at the same time, it is, the whole accomplishment is a marker of what it means to be individually worthy, but in a setting which has this pan-Hellenic, as I said, output and resonance. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for this. This was a wonderful comment and full of. I'm trying to organize my thoughts to see what sort of to pick up on. So thank you so much. I absolutely agree that in the expansion of praise, I didn't specifically think of the Pan-Hellenic community in that sense. I always think of Pindar's concentric circles of praise, which people have noted, right? The individual, the immediate family, the extended family, to include the mythical genealogies, and then the gods. But in terms of going back to tie it with Maria's question, I think these days people are more and more also talking about not just reperformance in the local community, which obviously makes a lot of sense, but dissemination of poetry, which was clearly happening from the earliest time, I believe. I mean, I'm not focusing so much on issues of reperformance, but these days there are a lot of studies, and I have come across more than once theories that the poetry, and also not just that the poetry would have been disseminated outside of the hometown in different parts of Greece, but that Pindar composed it with a view to that, which is why that's sort of how I come to this Pan-Hellenic view through looking at the use of myths that he incorporates in the poems. There are occasionally, and he's very fond of, and we can see why, local versions of particular myths. And in fact, Olympian 9, I think, is a really good example of that, where he ties the myth of flood and Deucalion and Pyrrha to specifically that location. But it's not, I think it's a very, so it's their myth, particularly relevant to that community, because they came from Mount Parnassus, which is in the neighborhood, but also it's a myth that would be recognized and appreciated elsewhere in the Hellenic world. So sort of going back to your point. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think Pindar was, I don't have a bad opinion of Pindar. I mean, I love him, but I think he was very much aware of his importance and of the weight of his poetry, and he imbued it with a potential to make sense and to be relevant in a much broader community than just the one where it would have been performed initially. Yes, thank you for that.
All right, our hour is about up. Any last questions, perhaps?
Yeah, if I may.
Sure.
I think it's very interesting how Pindar's voice and his audience shift even within a poem sometimes, and you know, like the honoree could sometimes feel like an eavesdropper, and vice versa, sometimes it's like a chorus waiting on the shores for the victor to return, and other times he's speaking intimately to the honoree, like I'm sorry that the poem is late, up super, or anyway. So you know, I think it's brilliant the way you look at the question you had for the house today, but it's so deeply ingrained in the style of Pindar that there are these shifts there, and it can turn on a relative pronoun.
Absolutely, or as you mentioned, personal pronoun, and I didn't get to this. I focused more on the here of the here now I complex of Deixis, but in fact, in addition to the vexed, as Maria echoed, question of where the songs would have been performed, perhaps at least for a short while, an even more vexed question was who performed them? Was it Pindar himself, and was it monody? Was it which was traditionally assumption, and I think these days still the more or less the consensus that it would have been a chorus, most likely of local citizens, again contributing to this sort of expansion of who are we referring to by I, even though so the chorus would have sung in the first person singular, or even would Pindar maybe lead the chorus. So it ended up, I think it was in the 90s, late 90s, in a series of back and forth articles with, in my opinion, pretty sort of narrowly minded examples of picking on these, is it I or is it we, who is performing? Whereas I think these days, and here I really have to sort of contribute my debt to Nancy Felsen, who is one of the people who is, I think, fighting for this polyvalency of Pindaric I, and I would say lyric I, but Pindaric definitely, that we can hear I, and at the same time imagine the composer in it, the chorus of performance, and whoever sort of identified with it. So yes, absolutely. The I is possibly even more controversial than here and this.
And one last question I see in the chat. You mentioned, Maša, that Pindar is aware of his own importance. The warning that he gives against hubris, is that something that's common to all of his odes, or how common is it?
I wouldn't say that the specific warning, the verbalizing of it, as here it's quite specific, was in Olympian 5, is not necessarily there, but the sense of it is. Even when he doesn't say, there are a couple of similar examples where he says, oh, we have gone too far, pull back the boat of the ship of my song back. But interestingly enough, very often sometimes it's for, we're not going farther than the Straits of Gibraltar, for example. So I love these references because they're very geographical in nature. But there is always the sense, and that final concentric circle that I was talking about, the audience for the songs are always divine as well in the end. And with that audience in mind, they're always hymns. I mean, he refers to his songs as hymns, and it's not just a lip service. They're very religious in tone, and as I mentioned, very often even tied to actual religious festivities. So yes, that sense of chorus, the excess, that it's a no-no, which is a very thin line that he treads so well, that the moment he has to praise the individual who comes, in fact, it's not just Pindar in his poetry, in that moment of victory, that is as close as a human can get to divinity. That's the sense in the odes and in wider Greek culture. But the moment we get there, there's always a little bit of pulling back. So even when he doesn't specifically mention hubris and chorus, and in fact, this is praised poetry, Pindar is very hesitant to use that kind of language. Olbos is usually olbos, which is prosperity, right, and a great thing. But that at the same time, you have a sense that anytime it's mentioned, there is the right way to deal with your olbos and the wrong way, and he is doing the poetry and the praise in the right way.
Thank you. I suppose we should not overstep our own bounds. I'm too far. So with that, thank you again, Maša, for this fascinating look into Pindar's odes. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Bye now. See you all next time.
Bye.